This is a guest essay written by Shauna Small.
I am a proud Jewish Zionist living in the diaspora. This is the core fabric of my identity, woven into my heart with 3,000 years of history. My ancestors and I are indigenous to the beautiful land of Israel that people read about in their scriptures, and that I feel with every ounce of my being. I beam with pride, together with the international Jewish community, each time Israel accomplishes another miracle that brings light unto all nations. I also cry collectively with my people when evil brings death upon one of our own. Together we pray, using our indigenous language, Hebrew, and turn our faces toward our beautiful Jerusalem in prayer, as it is written in our customs from thousands of years ago. Together we claim next year in Jerusalem, at the end of every Passover Seder, as we collectively yearn for the day of our return to our homeland. That day, however, may now have come for Jewish Canadians, who are faced with an unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism. As we watch in horror how the documented horrors of October 7, 2023, horrors perpetrated against our babies, children, elderly, women, and men, are set aside as hoaxes or irrelevant to the history of anti-Semitism and so-called anti-Zionism, we may not be paying close enough attention to the misguided efforts to change policy in boardrooms across Canada and in our legislature. Anti-Palestinian Racism. The new drive to introduce anti-Palestinian racism to equity and inclusivity strategies throughout this country and within our Canadian government must be a wake-up call. The current application of anti-Palestinian racism within school boards, without a legal definition of what constitutes this form of racism, is actually abhorrent. So what is anti-Palestinian racism, and how is it being defined? Well, it is basically anything that may be perceived to be anti-Palestinian, no matter how distorted pro-Palestinian has become. So, Zionism is anti-Palestinian racism, and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism is to be considered racist against Palestinians too. The Arab Canadian Lawyers Association released a framework for anti-Palestinian racism in a 42-page document that seeks to outline how anti-Palestinian racism is manifested and systemically embedded in Canada. Part of it says, quote, "Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. Anti-Palestinian racism takes various forms including denying the Nakba and justifying violence against Palestinians, failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people with a collective identity, belonging and rights in relation to occupied and historic Palestine, erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians, excluding or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives, Palestinians and their allies, defaming Palestinians and their allies with slander, such as being inherently anti-Semitic, a terrorist threat/sympathizer, or opposed to democratic values." End quote. I honestly never understood the concept of gaslighting until I read through this document. All the experiences that Jewish people have been faced with throughout Canada for over a decade, and especially since October 7th, are allegedly being faced by Palestinians in Canada too. Yet, their allegations of anti-Palestinian racism are not backed up with any data. According to this document, quote, "There currently is no reporting mechanism or formal data collection for anti-Palestinian racism in Canada. So the allegations of anti-Palestinian racism are not investigated and are being legitimized based on anecdotal stories." The Jewish people are indigenous to the land of Israel. According to the United Nations, common ancestry with the original occupants of these lands, along with a shared culture, constitutes indigenuity. The Jewish people all share some common DNA. Our relationship to one another and to our indigenous home is actually written in our genetics, according to recent genetic research. Furthermore, our indigeneity has been documented in texts for over 3,000 years. The people of Israel and our narratives are told in biblical and more modern-day texts. The children of Israel are even referred to in the Quran, since our history obviously predates Islam. Jerusalem as our capital is mentioned over 600 times in the Old Testament, but not ever mentioned in the Quran. If this is not enough evidence, then one can look at the archaeological evidence of our people that have been recovered throughout Israel. Anti-Semites like to blame Jews for killing Christ in Jerusalem, but will then say that we are new arrivals to the land. Well, which is it? Did we allegedly kill Christ 2,000 years ago? Or did we just arrive 100 years ago? We did not kill Jesus, and he was Jewish too, living and preaching in the land of his forefathers. We can feel our history in every grain of sand as we walk throughout Israel. But now, apparently, proclaiming our history and indigeneity to Israel would make the Jewish people guilty of anti-Palestinian racism. When we question the Palestinian narrative and present the evidence of our history, we are apparently complicit in, quote, traumatizing the Palestinian people by denying their truth. When we denounce a Palestinian narrative of the Nakba by presenting an alternate narrative, backed with reputable evidence that resulted in the declaration of independence of the sovereign state of Israel, we, by this definition, will be racist. Our children will be silenced throughout this country in combating the new face of anti-Semitism, which is taking the form of the erasure of our history. The chants of genocide that we hear in our streets to free Palestine from the river to the sea, which means to annihilate the state of Israel, which is situated between that river and sea, would no longer be considered anti-Semitism, since it is an expression of their identity and justified as quote-unquote Palestinian poetry that acknowledges their so-called resistance. Notably, when we ask for evidence of a state that was ever named Palestine in the past, there was never a sovereign territory called Palestine, or try to present the facts of 3,500 years of Jewish habitation on that land, it would be considered anti-Palestinian racism. The truth and reality that there has never been an independent state of Palestine, no less that Palestinian nationalism as a movement took off in the late 1960s, will no longer matter. According to the framework of anti-Palestinian racism set out by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, the suspension of Javier Davila, a Toronto District School Board teacher and equity coach, constitutes anti-Palestinian racism. His actions that involved the circulation of an anti-Semitic document to teachers throughout the board is irrelevant, since that document included the Palestinian narrative, so it is considered anti-Palestinian racism to disallow it. Never mind that the document included anti-Semitic rhetoric, denied Israel's right to exist, shared links to recognized terrorist organizations, and vilified the state of Israel. Yet, he is seen as the victim of anti-Palestinian racism, and the Jewish and Israeli staff and students who were targeted by this document are irrelevant, the anti-Semitism they faced, designed to be ignored. To add insult to injury, Jewish pride is also anti-Palestinian racism. The call for the annihilation of the State of Israel is referred to as so-called freedom of expression within the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association's document. In Canada, we have laws against hate speech and incitement of violence. Therefore, this framework of anti-Palestinian racism contravenes the laws we uphold in this country. For example, this excerpt from the association's 42-page document, quote, "Abroad, defenders of the State of Israel uphold and justify Israel's treatment of Palestinians by targeting its detractors. Over time, the efficacy of this defense of Israel has resulted in the othering, racialization, stereotyping, dehumanization, and discrimination of Palestinians and advocates in Canada and elsewhere. It also has led to the Palestine exception, where rights upheld for other individuals and groups are routinely denied to Palestinians and advocates, such as freedom of expression or freedom of association." End quote. Last week, Jewish Canadians proudly waved our Israeli flags through the streets of Toronto during our annual Walk with Israel, which brought more than 50,000 participants out. This solidarity with our homeland is being twisted into an evil expression of anti-Palestinian racism. Today, we see our flag regularly burnt at anti-Israel rallies. We see it taken off any displays within schools throughout the country since it is considered controversial, and we see it disallowed in professional sports arenas such as the Scotiabank Arena, where Toronto's NBA and NHL teams play their home games. What's more, Jewish students are regularly harassed, bullied, excluded, and assaulted. They feel unsafe sharing their faith or connection to their ancestral homeland. Social media is flooded with viral anti-Semitic hate, but instead of addressing this unimaginable rise in anti-Semitism, the government and school boards across Canada are choosing to focus their attention on implementing strategies to address anti-Palestinian racism that would, in fact, further marginalize and victimize the Jewish community. Again, it makes countering anti-Semitism a form of anti-Palestinian racism itself. It is a strange mix of Orwell and Kafka, if not just utterly preposterous. Whenever a Palestinian individual or an ally chooses to commit crimes according to Canadian law, such as incitement of violence or hate speech, condemnation of those actions could be classified as anti-Palestinian racism. The swarms of anti-Israel activists who chose to show up to the Walk with Israel with their keffiyehs wrapped around their faces were, quote-unquote, only expressing their identity. It doesn't matter that they harassed people, intentionally bumped into them to intimidate, or that they made violent hand signals and hateful speech. If we criticize those actions, then, according to this new proposed policy, we are guilty of anti-Palestinian racism. Take this example of anti-Palestinian racism, found in the aforementioned document. A Palestinian woman, Rasmea Odeh, was deported to Jordan from the United States in August 2017. It is apparently irrelevant that she lied on her immigration papers when moving to the United States. Lying on your immigration form is indeed a deportable offense. She was a convicted terrorist serving a life sentence who had been released from prison in Israel as part of a prisoner exchange with the terrorist organization, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. What was she convicted for? Placing 2 bombs at a supermarket and the British consulate in Jerusalem, killing Israeli civilians. But her criminal and immoral actions are apparently irrelevant. It only matters that she is Palestinian and being held accountable for her actions. Accordingly, and apparently, this makes it a case of anti-Palestinian racism. Israel is the only democratic country in the Middle East. It is a beautiful and inclusive country that thrives with a diverse population. There are almost 2 million Muslims who live and work alongside 7 million Jews. Israel is not a perfect country, and anyone can freely criticize governmental decisions in Israel, like its citizens frequently do. However, when you judge Israel by different standards than the rest of the world, deny it the right to defend its borders, call for its elimination, or claim that rape of Israeli women is quote-unquote justified, you are revealing your anti-Semitic bias. When you choose to use a fringe group of so-called anti-Zionist Jews as representative of the Jewish voice, you are tokenizing Jews to somehow legitimize anti-Semitism. When you choose to rename the map of Israel to Palestine, you are an anti-Semite. Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, and we can back that up with 3,500 years of history. We can also document our land purchases that legalize our right to the land. Our legal status as the national homeland of the Jewish people can be verified in the Mandate for Palestine, a legal document that was unanimously adopted by the League of Nations in 1920. In the aftermath of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire crumbled, several mandates were created and used to divide up land, so that countries could declare their independence. This resulted in the establishment of Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and also Israel. The Mandate for Palestine outlines the borders for the reconstitution of the Jewish homeland in Palestine, which the British occupied until 1948. The United Nations itself voted in 1947 to create one Arab and one Jewish state in what was then Palestine. How many countries in the world were established with a vote at the UN? Very few. But yet this is determined to be an illegitimate state. On May 14, 1948, Israel finally declared its independence from Britain. The next day, it was attacked by several Arab armies, and since that date, it has faced many wars and countless terror attacks in the continued struggle to destroy it. This is our history. However, Israel continued to embrace life and contribute to improving the world. Some of the most incredible modern-day innovations have come from Israel. With each contributions, Jews around the world beam with collective pride because we are all Israel. It is not just a land to us, it is our people, our history, and our future. The codification of anti-Palestinian racism would effectively legalize anti-Semitism. It vilifies Israel, and any effort to support that state seeks to have the fight against anti-Semitism become a zero-sum game and vows to erase our history and connection to Israel. Simply put, it contravenes the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism and seeks to silence Jewish voices. Now is the time to open our eyes to the threats to our existence that are happening right here in front of us. We cannot be silent.